This week, we interview Bob Stratton from Mach37. Joff is going to do a technical segment on how to black hole your Python. I mean, use Python to create a black hole or something like that. In our stories of the week, we're going to talk Pokemon Go. Enterprises leaving ICS vulnerable on the internet. The FBI says they're not malware because the FBI is good. Fearing a $50 charger. And holes in Drupal and fast food. All that and more. So stay tuned. This is a Security Weekly production. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Security Weekly is brought to you by the SANS Institute, the most trusted source for computer security training, certification, and research. Visit SANS.org to explore the full curriculum and latest training offerings. Onapsis, the leading provider of solutions to protect ERP systems from cyber attacks. Customers can secure their SAP and Oracle business-critical platforms from espionage, sabotage, and financial fraud and risks. Visit them on the web at onapsis.com. Pony Express. Check out their line of penetration testing devices, including the Pwn Pad, the Pwn Phone, and the Pwn Pro. For enterprises, there's Pwn Pulse, providing continuous visibility into wired, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth spectrums across all physical locations, including remote sites and branch offices. For all those hard-to-reach places, there's Pony Express. Visit them on the web at ponyexpress.com. Welcome, everyone, to Security Weekly. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, of course, broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios here in Rhode Island. I am flying solo here in the studio. However, for episode 473, being recorded on July 14th, 2016, I've got our illustrious host on via Skype. Mr. Jack Daniel is here with us tonight on via Skype. Hey, Jack.
What's up?
What's going on? Mr. Joff Fire is, of course, here with us, delivering the technical segment for this evening. Welcome, Joff.
Oh, g'day, Paul. Good to be here again, as usual.
In an anonymity mode is Mr. Carlos Perez. Welcome, Carlos.
Hey, Paul.
There was a podcast episode where I couldn't say anonymity. Was that last week, Jack, where you kept having to feed me more booze until I said it right?
You were having trouble with what? Operationalization.
Operationalization.
Yeah, I hate it when you can't operationalize your tongue.
I am on point tonight. Apparently, I can say all those words. No, I can't. Never mind. Including Michael Santarcangelo. Michael, welcome to the show. I got that one. It only took me how many episodes to get that right?
I look almost as good as Carlos looks.
Yeah. Well, you're both bald.
I like what you've got going with the shirt there.
You like my chest hair? Is that what you're saying? You want to run your fingers through it?
Where did you buy that? That's nice.
This was a gift from the Havana Club.
How much chest hair I've got.
It's awesome, Jack. It's wonderful. I don't have any announcements tonight. I do have on the lines via Skype Mr. Bob Stratton, a startup accelerator investing, Mach37 is where he works, which is a startup accelerator investing in information security product companies. Bob is a repeat offender with security startups and creating new security product categories and has been a network systems programmer and a penetration tester. Bob also currently sits on the Black Hat Content Review Board. When he's not raving about the days when internet RFCs all had 3-digit numbers, he's looking for security technologies that aren't baked yet, but might turn out to be the next right thing. Bob, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Well, it's an honor to have you on the show, Bob, and it's interesting. We were just chatting before the show. We have a whole new show called Startup Security Weekly, which, had I not messed up, would have released this week. However, there's music being created for it. But we've got episodes recorded 3, Michael? Did we do 3, right?
3. We've got 3 in the can.
3 in the can. So look for that coming soon to an RSS feed near you. And Bob, we talk about all of these topics every week now. We're going to invite you to be a guest on that show as well, which is going to be awesome. And Bob, so let me start off. How did you get your start in information security?
I did it the old-fashioned way. I was a little hacker kid and found my way onto this thing called the ARPANET to some places, some northeastern universities that basically decided if you could figure out how to get there, they would welcome you and maybe try to point you in the right direction. And so I got a chance to operate on some environments like the incompatible time-sharing system at the MIT AI lab, and didn't realize who Marvin Minsky was when I sent him email asking for advice about what to study, things like that. And
Back in the days when you had to buy time on a computer.
Much.
Now you carry one in your pocket every day. It's crazy.
With 4 cores.
Yeah, huh? That's amazing.
So, early on, I realized the internet was a thing for for communication almost as much as getting answers out of computers. And so I focused my whole career at a time when everybody wanted you to be a database programmer on network programming in the 80s, before the protocol wars had really settled out and TCP/IP had won the day. And got an opportunity to, work at the first company shipping TCP/IP applications for the Macintosh, a company called Intercon, and then helped start a local ISP. And somebody at my ham radio club said, "Hey, come do this thing I'm doing," and it turned out to be UUNet before they had raised their venture money.
Wow!
So building an ISP is an awesome experience, but it ruins you for everything smaller for a while.
That's really cool. I didn't know you were at one of the original UUNet folks. That's pretty cool.
I think it was 35 people when I started. So Life Pro career tip, if you go in your CEO's office and throw a temper tantrum about security and you actually use the cliche, you're either a part of the problem or a part of the solution, they might not fire you. They might tell you to go start a business unit.
Nice. That's great. So early on, you did some penetration testing as well. How has the penetration testing game changed in the past 15 years? Is it still useful, and what are some of the greatest values?
I think about that a lot, and I talk to a lot of CISOs doing what I'm doing now, and I think it's different. I mean, when I was doing it, we had to write tools while sitting on the floor of the machine room at the customer site because they often didn't have chairs in it. And, Metasploit wasn't a thing yet. And so I think the business has changed there's a commodity aspect of part of the business, which in some ways is great because it means more people have access to finding answers that might keep them out of trouble. At the same time, so one thing I don't think you have to do quite as much, and I'll defer to you guys on this, is convince the customers that maybe they ought to check. Because that was a big part of the business when I was doing it. It was like, why would we ever have a problem? We don't have a problem. We couldn't possibly have a problem. I think that vote is sort of in. But now I would say it's probably useful, just like understanding the distinction between a vulnerability assessment and a penetration test. I think if you have a plan for which it fills out a part of a need, it's absolutely a useful thing. I'm not convinced that all the people who do it or buy it necessarily are the ones who are going to get the most out of it. But by the same token, I'm sure there are some who don't do it who probably should.
So, Bob, it says you created startup companies in new product categories. What were some of your startups that you created?
So, Jack had just reminded me when he was telling me about the passing of the founder of Trusted Information Systems, Steve Walker. At UUNet, I had the opportunity to select products, and there really weren't a lot of choices. There were a few to help my customers protect themselves, given that they were starting to hook these, high bandwidth connections to the internet. High bandwidth being a T1, right? And I looked around, and the TIS Gauntlet had source code, and Marcus Random was kind of a known quantity. I knew where to find him. And so I wound up basically becoming a channel for TIS, and I moved a lot. I think it was just shy of $1 million worth of gauntlets in 6 months.
Wow. Back then, that's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of people convincing they need a firewall. I mean, because that fell in the same thing back then. They're like, why do I need a firewall?
Exactly. So I helped introduce that category. But when I left UUNet, I joined a startup called Wheel Group, which I'm pretty sure we beat ISS by about 6 months to market, if I remember right. But I'm old now, so I could be wrong about that. And the challenge we had with Network IDS was that everybody would now say, "Oh, you mean it's a firewall?" And I had to go through this whole exercise, explaining, no, it's this different thing. And the state of the art that we had been competing with, I know that in the military, there was a product or a technology that was run in a batch mode and would tell you 48 hours after the fact that you had been hacked. And that was awesome because it was better than what they had. And we wanted something that was a little bit more real time and that you could sit a relatively low-skilled person in front of and get.
Wait, that project that the military government was using, was that Stephen Northcutt's?
It was called ASIM.
Yeah, okay. No,
I don't remember who wrote it. I think it might have come out of, I don't know if it came out of the Information Warfare Center, but I think it might have.
Was it basically just TCP dump logs that were just being parsed? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
That was similar to what Stephen created way back in the day, too.
It got them something they didn't have, right, at the time. And at a time when they were starting to see attacks ramp up, compared to, relatively speaking. And so we went through this whole exercise of basically helping to create the category. And it was us and Chris Klaus at ISS trying to say, well, there's this other thing you can do that will tell you with some nuance about what's actually going on in real time on your network. Wouldn't you like that? And what I learned in that exercise is that, I also helped ship one of the very first T1 speed DES packet encryptors in like 1994.
Wow.
UNet had fundamental patents on what you'd now call VPNs, and we built our own hardware. And what I learned there is that in every single circumstance, when you introduce a category, you probably are signing up to about a 2-year project and a lot of money to educate the market, even if you basically have invented fire. There's work to do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So fast forward to today, Bob, and I want to know what your crystal ball looks like. How do you predict which security technologies are the next big thing?
Predict might not be the right word, although I do have a company that actually is oriented towards predicting cybersecurity events. But, the way I look at it is I look at holes in the market, and I'm going to be candid here, just between us and your whole audience. I think we had about a 10-year period where innovation in the security product space was really kind of moribund. I think FireEye and DLP were about the only two things that happened over a span of about a decade, and which is problematic. So I look for a couple of things. I look for obviously unserved markets or underserved markets, and in our investment thesis, for example, we have I think taken some risk, but basically adopted the premise that we think the mid-market is unserved by the product vendor world and or underserved, and that they are attack surface for everybody in the global 2000. So isn't it worth our time to think about how to protect the smaller guys too? We look at emerging. I've got an IPv6 security company, and I think you guys probably all know the founder of that one, Joe Klein. But really, what I look for are problems that aren't solved. I look for what are people frustrated about? What are they complaining about? What the pain? Everybody talks about pain points. It's a real thing. I mean, no one has solved this problem. So what I'm trying to figure out is, how do you take the expertise of someone, encapsulate some tiny piece of it in some reproducible way so that that person in some way can be 1,000 places at once?
Mm.
Because if you're billing 8 hours a day, no matter how great you are at what you do, you can't be in enough places to make as big a dent as I think a lot of us would like to.
You know, you said something very interesting, Bob, that I had not considered before, and that is the mid-market, or what I think a lot of larger security companies today, especially kind of call small business. The larger security companies, even like medium-sized security companies, are going after the big fish. They're going after the large enterprises because they got to meet their sales quotas, and they got to grow, and they got to show investors that they can make money. So they're targeting the enterprises. I don't fault them for that. I mean, I have my own startup. We're doing the same thing. I mean, but what you're saying is in the mid-market, that kind of leaves a gap because a smaller business can't afford the big enterprise solution, so they're left like with whatever's left. And in that space, why don't they have more options? And what are the options that are out there?
You're absolutely right. There's a demand for advanced capabilities. And, you know, in the course of talking to people, we hear it all the time. People want these advanced capabilities, but there's a thing, for example, we call it the SIM cliff. I mean, if you've got to drop $5 million to deploy a technology, that's probably not going to happen, even in companies with maybe 2,500 employees.
Yep.
And yet, when you look at the magnitude of some of those mid-market companies in the grand scheme of things, they're in everybody's supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're a customer or a vendor or something. They're interconnected with somebody else who's bigger. And as we know, with at least one major retailer, that was the attack vector that someone used. So,
well, both Target and Wendy's apparently, right?
Good point. And so we understand that it's a difficult challenge. It's not just big guys, like you say. My joke is every startup's trying to sell to the same 100 customers, usually they're financials, right? I mean,
but there's also smaller financials too, which kind of reemphasizes your point. It could be a very small financial company that's managing tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars of people's money, but still needs that same level of security as the larger financials.
That's right. It's absolutely right. And I have discovered in kind of the regional banking world, there are these service providers that actually sort of aggregate across a number of those companies. But the point's the same. If you try to buy enterprise product and deploy it that way, it tends not to work. And at the same time, when you go further down, I mean, I joke because on FM radio at drive time here on the news stations, there are ads, there are Barracuda ads on the radio. And I think that there's a tier of capability. I think you see Fortinet pushing up into it a little bit, but there's a lot of space between managed UTM and people with ArcSight, right?
Yeah. I agree.
Is I think fertile ground, but it's a different marketing model, a different sales strategy. It's not if you try to sell the same way you sell to enterprises, you're probably going to have some trouble because it's a different market.
The return on investment calculation for me for that mid-market is, as a startup, somewhat troubling, right? I mean, we're a startup that has software that is more geared towards enterprises. When you look at that smaller sized company, the return on investment is tough. What advice do you have for security startups that are trying to hone in on that good return on investment for that type of customer?
So, it's funny. My partner Dan is actually instinctive about this. He's really good at it. But the minute you tell me how much your thing costs, I'm thinking about, depending on which of us you ask, how many of those you have to sell to get to somewhere between 40 million, 40 million or 100 million in valuation.
Oh, so you jump right to 40 to 100 million valuation. Okay, good to know. Good to know.
But there's a multiplication exercise that goes on here.
Yeah.
How many of these do I have to sell to make my company worth something that will make everybody happy? Hopefully, It's not just the investors. And
make everyone money is what you mean by making everyone happy.
While they're asleep. That's right.
Yes.
But there are other challenges. Having been at Astaro, the UTM spaces you're talking about with smaller businesses, it's not just who's got the money, it's what the cost of that customer is. The further you go down market, the less likely you are to have a large, experienced and trained workforce, and that drives your support costs up. And if you don't factor that in, you are in deep trouble because some of those organizations are great, and my background is SMB, and I love those folks. But from the vendor perspective, you have to know what you're getting into and understand you're probably not only going to have to discount to get within their budget, but they're going to be, in many cases, a more expensive customer, or in some ways, they're going to be a more expensive customer. Also,
it affects how you design your product, how flexible you want to make it, or how abstract to the customer you want to make it. The more abstract you make your product, the less support calls you have because you're taking away all of the settings that they can modify and change that will cause those support calls, but at the same time, you're removing flexibility.
Well, yeah, and that ramps up your development time, which I'm sure you're also looking at, Bob.
Yep.
When you're going to go to market. Well, if you want it to be useful to everyone, it's going to take us 6 months to develop that.
But I think just to add in on that, I think it's viable to abstract away a lot of functionality if you want to get something in the hands of the small medium market that actually still works, maybe not perfection, but gets you the sale and keeps your support costs to a reasonable level. And I think there's big opportunities there that a lot of the information security vendors really are missing.
And
it's just finding that balance.
I agree. I will say, user experience matters, and maybe it's because I was a Mac developer at one point in my life. If you look at the design of a lot of large enterprise products, from a user experience standpoint, it's appalling. And, as a pilot, I can tell you, usability has a direct correlation to safety. And I think it's an area that it amazes me that in our sector we're only now getting to the point where there are people kind of dedicating time to this usable security concept as if it's like a new good idea.
Is it because a lot of the security companies are started by nerds? Is that most technology?
Yes.
Is it more prevalent in security, Bob? Is the issue that I really want to dig down deep into. All of my friends that I know and love in the security community, right? I mean, they're starting companies, but at heart, we're nerds. We like to write software and tinker with hardware, and the user experience is kind of further from our minds.
I think it goes further than that, Paul. If you don't mind me chiming in, it's not just the nerd aspect. It's the nerd aspect combined with that idea of an entirely distasteful attitude towards simplifying the control aspect of the product in question. They don't want to take away the knobs and dials, because the knobs and dials, from the pure security perspective, are incredibly important, and people can't seem to bridge that gap. That's my opinion, anyway.
There's a meta aspect to this too, which is empathy matters. If you don't have empathy for your customers, you probably are going to be detached from the problem that you're solving in a way that isn't really going to help.
So what advice do you have for companies that need to improve upon the user experience?
So, actually having somebody who does that for a living is a really good start.
I agree.
I had told people, God, I think it was about 10 years ago now, if you're about to buy a security product from a relatively smaller company and they don't have, human factors people on staff, reconsider the purchase, because I would rather, the risk of misinterpreting a security event is potentially, so think about it. If you think you're protected and are not, aren't you potentially at a greater exposure than if you aren't protected and know that's true?
But what I don't know about can't hurt me, Bob.
Oh, well, now he tells me. So I think, you have to have empathy for your customer. And the other part of it is that people like to build what they like to build, and they're not building something that addresses the problem. And so the zealous thing that and maybe this is a later question, but the thing I always harp on anyone presenting to me or any of my companies is something to the effect of, if I ask you what problem you're solving and it sounds like a good thing or a benefit or a feature, you haven't answered the question. If it starts with, I don't have the budget for, I don't have time for, I can't quickly enough do X, then maybe you're actually talking about a problem. And I've recently added a corollary, which is that if people don't wince when you describe the problem you're solving, pick a better one.
Mm. That was one of my questions, is that when people pitch you, what's the most common mistake they make? That's definitely one of them. What are some other ones?
So we talked a little bit about not thinking about the implication of price in the grand scheme of things.
Mm-hmm.
I think we, at Mach37, we admittedly have a bias towards technical founders. A lot of investors don't. That having been said, a good company has a well-rounded team, and early on, you have a lot of people doing a lot of jobs, but it's not like you should have one person doing every job. I think not finding co-founders. Actually, I have two. The biggest one I find in the security space is that companies or founders hurt themselves by being unwilling to talk about what they're doing all the time. And I have seen far, far more entrepreneurs and companies hurt because they were too cagey about what they had done or what they were trying to do than I have ever seen because someone ripped them off.
Mm.
Yeah, stealth mode can go too far. You can right into oblivion.
Stealth mode's great when you're a big company like Google and you're announcing a new product. Awesome for stealth mode, right? But not when you're a startup, is what I'm hearing, Bob.
Yeah. If you're Apple announcing an iPhone.
Yeah.
You should be talking to everybody.
Mm.
I think that's a really interesting comment, actually, because I think there's a certain balance. Because you don't want to give away all of your secrets, but at the same time you got to promote like crazy. If you're starting up and you're small, you've got to talk to everybody. There's no choice.
It's not promotion. It's actually listening. The problem is you need to understand whether the thing you want to do actually solves a problem, and at some level for which people are willing to pay. Promotion happens once you know the answer to that.
Right.
The issue is to figure out what you should build. You should be talking to, obviously you should try and qualify them, but frankly, quantity may be better than quality early on, because the error tends to always be on the side of not talking to enough people.
Yeah, so what I think I hear you saying is actually not so much talking, but having conversations with probably a very large portion of that conversation being listening.
Yeah, we do.
Always.
I mean, we do that for our own startup right now because that's the mode we're in. We're obviously not in a heavy promotions mode for exactly the reasons that Bob described. We're pitching our solution to a problem to get people's reaction, to make sure that we're doing the right thing and make changes now before we build more stuff. You're nodding your head. That's good. I'm glad, Bob.
It's the way to do it. I mean, someone actually quoted this in the Silicon Valley show. I can't remember who said it, but if you're not embarrassed when you release your minimum viable product, you've waited too long.
Yeah, it's funny. I just wrote today, if you wait until you're ready to launch, you waited too long. Like, you've got to go right at that moment when you don't think you're ready. You're terrified. You figure you're going to be embarrassed. So, yep.
We've all been there, right? You have a situation where you put a thing in front of somebody, and then they start telling you how it needs to be purple, or have gold chains on it, or whatever it is.
Wow, you brought back some memories with the color purple and vulnerability assessment software, Bob. I have Agita now.
Routers. Remember the purple routers? So, the putting something in front of someone is actually by far the best way to get usable feedback out of them. Even if it's just wireframe drawings of your UI.
Yep.
That has actually worked just fine in a lot of cases.
So
that's actually good, because we have like a YouTube video that we show people.
That's a really interesting point, because I think that delineates the people that are more marketing driven from those that are more technically driven, because those of us who are more technically driven, and I guess I count myself amongst this crew, we have an immediate, almost visceral negative reaction to that, right? Because it's like, it's not perfect.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
I used to
It's
be
not.
that guy.
It's also not secure.
Right, and that's a really difficult thing to get past, which is why highly technically driven and creative people need to be partnered with those that are willing to take that risk and put those prototypes up in front of other folks. Otherwise, it's never going to work.
Now, Michael, I know you've been a little quiet so far, and I know you've got a lot of thoughts on what Bob has said already, because you and I have had a lot of discussions that no one else has heard but you and I and the production team. Is there anything that you want to ask Bob about what he said, or any other questions that I haven't asked yet? I want to give you the floor for a moment.
Yeah, there's an area that we haven't hit on, but I'll start by saying I've loved all of it, and that's great, because we need a lot more of this in that startup scene. But Bob, when you look out at the landscape of security stuff, I think there's kind of two challenges, and I'm going to look at them the same way. We just talked about the need to get out there and talk to people and be able to listen. But if we go look at a lot of the people, at least the frontline, those security leaders, they are so inundated right now. They don't have time to poke their head up, and they're struggling to figure out, who should I give my time to or not. Same time, when you're a startup, I'm starting to sense that we're going to be at that VHS Betamax moment where the better communicated startup might outpace the one that's got the better technology. Those are somewhat similar, although slightly different challenges. How do we, as an industry, start to get some of that matchmaking to happen a little bit better?
I mean, I think actually, conversations like this, there was a time when I don't think in this industry there were that many podcasts that would have this kind of conversation with a room full of practitioners. So I think you're sort of doing the Lord's work there already. At the same time, I think it's interesting. There are these, I guess I'd call it folklore. There's folklore about the investment world, which is often based on certain realities. There's also folklore about the procurement and customer world. And I think the reality is, you spend enough time in this industry, you realize that there are very active customers that pilot very early technologies.
Yeah.
In a structured or rigorous way, all the time. I mean, I remember, I won't say which bank it was, but I know even when I was in the early 90s or mid 90s, late 90s, when I was at Wheel Group, one of the very large banks had us at their annual gathering of all of their CISOs, and there are a zillion of them because they're all over the planet. And they had us with a table in the back of the room, and ISS had a table in the back of the room next to us, and a bunch of companies nobody had heard of yet, in this meeting of this gigantic bank, of all the CISOs within this, like globally within this big bank. And they do this stuff all the time. So it's not like the customers don't take shots at new stuff. They do it constantly. You just have to be smart about it.
Yeah.
Well, so
go ahead, Mike.
I'm sorry, Paul. I'm going to step on you.
Yeah,
Bob, I'm going to play to a natural bias, obviously, with what you do with Mach37. But here in South Carolina, we're spending a lot of time looking at how we bring together startups, whether they're in an incubator or an accelerator, or whether they're just kind of still working out of somebody's garage, and impart some level of security to them. Do you think then that, or maybe I should ask you differently, have we evidence that the people who participate in an accelerator like Mach37 can get some of that time and some of that mind share and some of that attention easier than somebody who's trying to do it out of the garage? Or is it still going to come back to who's involved, what are their relationships, how well do they craft that story that gets someone to want to pay attention?
So I can tell you, when we started, so we've been doing this since the fall of 2013. We've invested in and helped launch 35 security product companies, and have built a mentor network that is, I don't know, 220 plus in terms of people that are formally registered. Our larger, mailing list of folks is probably 10 times that. And I remember we had a couple of CISOs from large financials, and I remember that the day we got the call from a third one saying, "Hey, I noticed that some of my colleagues are doing this stuff with you. What do I need to do to get involved?" Additionally, we've recently we've got had General Dynamics and Amazon Web Services come on as platinum sponsors. And in all of these cases, there's interest in seeing what is coming down the road for, I guess I call it strategic purposes. The people who have those jobs don't want to be blindsided either by a threat or a mitigation opportunity. And so, yeah, I would say we've been humbled by the degree that our colleagues of, I won't say how long our careers are, right? But our colleagues of the past N years have really just been amazing about supporting us and our companies, whether it's giving them feedback or trying their stuff or signing on as mentors or advisors. People want this space to be want information security or cybersecurity, whatever you want to call it, to be more effective than it is, and they're willing to help people who are embarking on the job of trying to do that.
Now, Bob, I want to play devil's advocate for a moment, and speaking a lot from my own experiences, not just recently, but in the past, I've found that there's a lot of people in information technology, and especially in the security in an organization, that are highly skeptical of new companies. And I believe that one of the reasons that a lot of us in IT and security are skeptical is that we've been burned. The people who've been doing it long enough to have been burned, that brought in a vendor, that paid that vendor out of their budget, convinced their managers that you should buy this, and the project falls flat on its face, they got burned. Now, when you're a new company and you're going to sell a product to a company like this, they are highly skeptical. How do we bring these people around?
I mean, I think it's prudent to be skeptical when you're betting the security of your company on something, right? So in some respect, I would always hope that they would be rigorous and skeptical in their process. That having been said, I can tell you I've been to security investor events as recently as a couple months ago, and the consensus there was that the enterprises have never been more willing to try new stuff than they are now. Obviously, they've got to believe that you are somebody who might know what you're doing or have built something that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But I welcome prudence, because that's how products become better products. But I don't think what I would say is you should always be careful of generalizations and hyperbole. Right?
Because I agree. Stepping down from the devil's advocate, there's a lot of FUD. And there always has been, right? Ever since I started working for a university in 2001, and we were acquiring security products because, well, there was worms running around the network infecting all of our machines. So we needed security products, and there's an incredible amount of FUD. I totally get that. What I want to kind of transition to today is, what advice do you have for people looking to acquire security technology that can help them evaluate properly those security technologies? And I worked for a vulnerability management vendor. Everyone knows I worked for Tenable Network Security for 7 years. And that was one of my kind of soapboxes, was make sure that you have the right evaluation criteria and test these things properly before you implement them. I don't see a whole lot of standards and help for people in that realm unless you can point me to some knowledge or direction or resource.
So I think it depends on the technology area. And by the way, Jack Hufford came to, he was one of the dinner speakers in our Security Leaders Dinner Series, and he just absolutely killed it. It was awesome.
I love Jack.
I think there are some spaces. So it turns out if you're looking at spam or phishing, or if you're looking at antivirus, there are what seem to be some collaboratively produced figures of merit or test methodologies or something that people have converged around. I think some people are trying to do it in other spaces, but when you look at the fact that, from year to year, we're not sure. I don't think any given buyer knows whether they're going to be instantiating virtual machines in some infrastructure as a service provider or deploying software-defined networking gear, or like what the it is going to be.
Yeah.
I think I will say this. I think the ITIL people, as much as I eschew sort of management religions, there's something to be said for always trying to do certain things the same way, because then you can figure out whether they went the way you expected. And so testing is no different. You know, any company can crib or Google for or develop a consistent set of things that they are going to bang things against. Test data can be hard sometimes. Any researcher will tell you that. It's hard to find test data. But I mean, if all you do is apply a little bit of rigor in your own evaluation methodology, you can go a long way.
And testing security technologies is not easy. I will say that. I mean, like I said, I worked in the vulnerability management space. Testing a vulnerability scanner is hard. There are tons and tons of variables in just that one technology that you happen to deploy in your network, which I hope you do if you're securing an enterprise or whatever you're trying to secure, right?
You know, let me chime in on something though too, because this is where I'm going to come back to that. As an industry, how do we start to foster some of this? I've actually been on some calls where Fortune 50 companies have said to some of these startups, I'll tell you what, come into the lab and let's see what you can do, and I'll throw a couple engineers at it and we'll see what we can do to help you if you need it. And the startups are like, nah, we're good, thanks. And my jaw hit I couldn't believe it that was even happening. But the more salient part to that is we talk about testing methodology, and it's tough to find, right? We talk about the social proof and how these types of things work. And I know everybody's always worried about admitting whether they did or didn't do something or do or don't work with somebody. But this is one of those things where if you've got a lab and you want to see what's coming down the pipe, or you want to be involved in it, and you got some cycles where you can help test it out and ask. Sometimes you don't have to have answers. I think, you know, Jeff, you pointed to that where but it's not perfect yet, but it's not right. Yeah. So what I've learned in my own efforts with this is if we can have those conversations, they're great, right? Like having the conversation is great. Showing somebody the wireframe or a YouTube video, that's better. Throwing it in the lab and checking it out and kicking the tires, they may not turn into a sale, but the value that you'll get from that as a startup is phenomenal. But you know what? The enterprise will too, because when you ask about, well, how do you evaluate it? They don't. If somebody tells you they know, right now, they're making that up like the rest of us are. But they run a couple of these things through a lab. They see some of the different. They'll get better at testing and evaluation. And then if we can, as a industry and a society, amplify that a little bit, that's how we get better.
So yeah, I just want to respond to that. I mean, I am working with Paul somewhat on the project that we're doing, and we exactly take advantage of that. We have customers that are willing to partner with us and allow us to have test environments, and we use them.
Yeah.
You know, it's
and it's a mutual benefit, the biggest, right, Jeff? I mean, they're getting benefit from it. You're getting benefit from it.
Oh, it's absolutely.
Everybody.
Well, yeah, it's a huge benefit for us when people say, "Well, what's the performance like?" and we can say, "Well, we've tested it, right?" I mean, that's for a startup, that's huge.
Yeah, and you know, just and we've got not to name any names, but you know, we've got customers that are anywhere from 50, 60 endpoints to 60,000, and it's important to have that sort of exposure as a startup experience and be able to play in those worlds, because otherwise you'll never know. So I'm blown away, frankly, Michael, by the idea that somebody would say no to that.
I was blown away.
My question for you,
both
Bob.
Of you are being idealistic and stuff.
Yeah, I know.
My question for
I know, Jack. Isn't that a surprise?
You assume that they have any intention of ever selling product. They're selling a company, or they're trying to sell their company or their intellectual property before they have to ship product, because shipping product requires that you have decent code and you have an ability to deploy it and back it up. And if you walk around the edges of RSA, or that's the one that's easiest to spot them at, You can see the companies that plan on building product and the other companies that plan on selling the company or their ideas, and hope that somebody will give them money for their IP so they don't have to do real work.
But that's a great point, Jack.
That's interesting.
I
Yeah.
want Bob. I want to.
It's you should walk around with Marcus or Strat. You and I could walk around. That'd be a great startup
Well,
podcast.
and as a segue into Bob talking about it, this is
that'd be a
Paul.
great
This is a
startup
story.
podcast.
If I didn't put this in for tomorrow's startup, it's next week's. I've got a whole thread on this, so it's a good point. You're fair, Jack.
Walk around and
I'm going to keep being optimistic. Damn it, we will make a difference.
Well, Bob, you've been to. We were both at one Curmudgeon Con, and it's great having the old timers where Spaff eventually says, "Who saw something new and exciting?"
Yeah.
So, Bob, with respects to evaluating security companies, whether they're new or whether they've been around for a little while, where do we stand with sharing information? Because some of the ways that I get information is either my own independent testing, or I talk to people who have a lab that are like, oh yeah, I tested some of those products, and you know what? These two are complete crap. They're what Jack's talking about. They don't have a real product, and these other ones were okay, but this one was the best. And I feel like a lot of us in the community have that information, but we're not allowed to share it for whatever reason, or we don't share it for whatever reason. What can we do to solve that problem?
I think, at the risk of sounding like a Pollyanna, I actually think that it's so much better than it used to be.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yep.
I mean, some of my companies are actually engaged with certain ISACs and things who have collectively said, we actually think there's an opportunity here and we'd like to figure it out. And so there are, I know the retail guys just spun their thing up. There are structures that certainly didn't exist when I started out in this industry that exist now that have come a long way to provide some leverage. Additionally, I don't know if you've seen things, so just to bring the startup angle in a little bit, there's a thing called the FinTech Innovation Summit, which is basically sponsored by about 16 banks in New York and New Jersey, and they take 6 companies each summer, and it's kind of like an accelerator, except your mentor is a room full of people from a big bank. And one of our companies went through that exercise. So there are these sort of collaborative environments where people, certainly within certain industry sectors, are definitely sharing information. I know that when I've been at certain bigger vendors in the past, there were kind of formalized information sharing exercises that the government was trying to do, which someday might be useful, but the time scale on which those things operate from a policy level tends to be geologic compared to what people in the trenches and startups are doing. But it will eventually lead to some useful things, I suspect. So I think there are collaborative organizations. I think there are mechanisms that, whether they're multilateral or bilateral or communal, where people are sharing data, I think that we've actually seen no dearth of kind of ad hoc open source-ish. I mean, even for threat intel, or a bunch of different bins that people are throwing stuff into. What they're getting out of it is another story entirely. But so, I think, again, it depends on the industry. Some are more mature than others about this, but I see it improving kind of everywhere. And if your general counsel won't let you share innocuous data with other people, at that point, there's a C-level policy conversation that needs to happen. And I don't know what the enterprise equivalent of "Why do you hate America" is, but that's what I'd be asking them.
So, sort of along those lines, Bob, what are the hot security technologies in product areas right now?
So one of the fun things about doing what I do is that I've noticed these, and it's this emergent phenomenon. These trends happen even within my own twice a year cohort selection. And
please say hunt teaming. Please say hunt teaming. Just kidding.
So it's interesting. insider threat detection / user and entity behavioral analytics or other ways of doing it
Yep.
seem to be on the ascendancy right now. I'm just now surprisingly starting to see more on what Gartner is calling distributed deception environments, which some of which is what we used to call honeypots, but there's some other new different stuff there too, including some novel, some ways to detect that someone's doing something even on your real systems because of things that aren't real that are laying around. So there's some of that going on. Other than that, I guess previously we did have a bit of a run around novel mechanisms for detecting malware or analyzing and characterizing it. That was sort of last fall for me. So, and of course, the IoT, which is probably the thing I lose the most sleep about. There's a lot of greenfield there. There's a lot of opportunity. If you want to be, if you're a smart person out there and you're trying to figure out how to do something cost effectively at ridiculous scale with a decent user experience, like that is the place I would be spending.
That's good general advice. Yes. And IoT device security is hot.
Yep.
Yeah, it is. Hey, Strat, let's go back to before this, a conversation you and I had a couple of years ago about the things that we know we need. You turned me into a couple of interesting reports, and we had a conversation at B-Sides Delaware a couple of years ago about this, that things that we've defined problems or problem spaces, and people really haven't come up with the workable ideas. And sometimes it's a matter of we just need the programming languages, the hardware, things like that to catch up. People had ideas decades ago, and until we had in processor virtualization, they weren't really feasible. Any of those things that we talked about, from like the Cyber Leap Year project or some of those other projects that you and I have discussed that come to mind, is why isn't somebody doing this?
Well, I mean, I actually know some of the whys, but it doesn't stop me from still wanting to see them. I mean, if I'm a huge believer that if you build systems that don't have the states that can't execute, can't even have the states that involve failure modes, there's an argument to say that there could be some real security and, frankly, reliability benefit there. So, Harvard architectures are one of those things that actually a lot of what we use today are sort of hybrid and have elements of these other process architectures. But, there is an argument that data should only ever be data, and that even when you have things like data execution prevention and NX-bit and all that, it's still sort of this advisory suggestion, because memory doesn't know what data is versus what instructions are. And, I do think, so what I would say going forward, the Internet of Things to me, it not only is potentially some really grave risk at very large scale, but also great opportunity, because if you don't have legacy compatibility requirements, especially with regard to things like embedded platforms, you might be able to do some things that are just prohibitive for compatibility reasons in the kind of IT workstation server world, like security tagged architectures. Data in memory should be a thing that could never be an instruction. And there is this argument that if you're going to build a zillion cheap platforms and you're licensing cores anyway, and essentially tweaking them to suit your little application, there's never been a greater opportunity to try some different things, which it turns out may not be new because the research was done in the 80s or the 70s even. So I think that we could harden systems at scale at lower costs than ever before in history. And if some of that flows back up to regular computers, well, that would just be awesome. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Bob, unfortunately, we're running short on time. We could keep talking, but we're going to bring you back on the Startup Show. I am going to pledge that tomorrow the URL startup.securityweekly.com will work, where you can go find our show. we're going to bring Bob on that show as well. Bob, I do have 5 questions to end this interview segment with. Are you ready?
I am.
Bob Stratton, 5 questions on Security Weekly. 3 words to describe yourself.
Playful, irreverent, polymath.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Poison.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
Give it a shot.
In the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby, do you prefer to go first or second?
You know, I've thought very long about this. My answer has actually changed. Now that I'm older, I like surprises second.
Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Dr. Richard Feynman and Hedy Lamarr.
Excellent. Bob, thank you very much.
Great answers.
Yes, for playing 5 questions and for coming on the Security Weekly show. It was wonderful having you. I look forward to a follow-up interview on Startup Security Weekly, startup.securityweekly.com.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
Stay tuned.